Scenario: agreement. If you are in agreement during a meeting, then the phrase would be, I completely agree with your point about topic. It's crucial for our success. Example: I completely agree with your point about customer satisfaction. It's crucial for our success. Scenario: disagreement. If you have a different perspective, the phrase would be, I see where you're coming from, but I have a slightly different perspective on issue. Example: I see where you're coming from, but I have a slightly different perspective on the budget allocation. Scenario: agreement. If you're in agreement and want to show support, the phrase would be, you've made a strong case for idea and I'm on board with that approach. Example: you've made a strong case for expanding into new markets and I'm on board with that approach. Scenario: partial agreement. If you agree but want to suggest an alternative, the phrase would be, while I agree with most of what you've said, I believe we should also consider alternative solution. Example: while I agree with most of what you've said, I believe we should also consider a phased rollout. Scenario: agreement. If you're aligned with a proposal, the phrase would be, I'm in agreement with your proposal regarding topic and I think it's the right direction for us. Example: I'm in agreement with your proposal regarding the marketing strategy, and I think it's the right direction for us. Scenario: disagreement. If you understand the viewpoint but have reservations, the phrase would be, I understand your viewpoint, but I have some reservations about specific aspect. Example: I understand your viewpoint, but I have some reservations about the timeline for implementation. Scenario: agreement. If you support a convincing argument, the phrase would be, your argument is convincing, and I support the plan to move forward with proposal. Example: your argument is convincing, and I support the plan to move forward with a new product launch. Scenario: partial agreement. If you agree but want to add an additional consideration, the phrase would be, I agree with your analysis on topic, but I'd suggest we look into additional consideration. Example: I agree with your analysis on cost reduction, but I'd suggest we look into potential risks. Scenario: disagreement. If you appreciate insights but see a different angle, the phrase would be, I appreciate your insights on issue, though I think we need to address different angle. Example: I appreciate your insights on team productivity, though I think we need to address employee well-being. Scenario: agreement. If you're aligned with a perspective and want to enhance a strategy, the phrase would be, I'm aligned with your perspective on topic, and I think implementing suggestion would enhance our strategy. Example: I'm aligned with your perspective on customer retention, and I think implementing a loyalty program would enhance our strategy. Scenario 1: clarification. If you are seeking clarification, then the phrase would be, could you please clarify what you meant by specific term/statement? Example: could you please clarify what you meant by strategic alignment? Scenario 2: more details. If you are asking for more details, then the phrase would be, I'm not entirely clear on aspect. Could you provide more details? Example: I'm not entirely clear on the timeline for this project. Could you provide more details? Scenario 3: process explanation. If you need an explanation of a process, then the phrase would be, can you explain how specific process/concept works in more depth? Example: can you explain how the approval process works in more depth? Scenario 4: elaboration. If you want the other person to elaborate on a point, then the phrase would be, I'd appreciate it if you could elaborate on point to ensure I understand fully. Example: I'd appreciate it if you could elaborate on the budget allocation to ensure I understand fully. Scenario 5: requesting an example. If you need an example for better understanding, then the phrase would be, could you provide an example of term/concept to help me grasp it better? Example: Could you provide an example of how the KPI is calculated to help me grasp it better? Scenario 6. Requesting more information. If you need additional information, then the phrase would be, I need a bit more information on specific detail. Could you go over it again? Example, I need a bit more information on the client requirements. Could you go over it again? Scenario 7. Breaking down a process. If you need a process broken down, then the phrase would be, can you break down process/procedure for me? I want to make sure I'm following correctly. Example, can you break down the onboarding process for me? I want to make sure I'm following correctly. Scenario 8. Further explanation. If you are having trouble understanding, then the phrase would be, I'm having trouble understanding detail. Could you explain it further? Example, I'm having trouble understanding the contract terms. Could you explain it further? Scenario 9. Clarifying next steps. If you need to clarify the next steps, then the phrase would be, could you clarify the next steps for project/task so I can proceed accordingly? Example, could you clarify the next steps for the marketing campaign so I can proceed accordingly? Scenario 10. Requesting background information. If you need more context or background information, then the phrase would be, I'd like more context on subject. Could you provide additional background information? Example, I'd like more context on the recent policy change. Could you provide additional background information?